Thank you, Rekha. Let us pray. Our gracious, loving Father, we thank you for this opportunity to look into this passage, and we ask that you would lead us by your Spirit so that we can understand it more. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. In The Sign of Four, the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes tells Watson, "How often have I said to you that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth?" Hold on to this quote as we explore our passage. If you are on the Christalaya WhatsApp group, you will know that Santosh shared a link to a TED talk by Malcolm Gladwell about the incident between David and Goliath, and I hope that all of you have actually watched that TED talk. If you have, and if you were surprised by some of the things that Gladwell mentioned in his talk, let me make a small request from you. Forget it all. No, I'm just kidding. No, not forget it all. Not all of it. It was a wonderful talk. Gladwell makes some very good and interesting points, important points. He clarifies a number of issues. However, he failed to take into account a couple of things which would have actually made him hit right on the spot. Right for this passage also. So, don't forget all of it. Keep it in mind. Just hold on to it a little lightly. The Bible has contributed many sayings and images to the English language, and I'm sure to other languages also. We can think of turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, and our passage today gives us this image of the two main characters. So David and Goliath. If you say that, you know, people kind of have an idea of what you're talking about. It's a very forceful image, and so enticing is it that most of our action movies or even fantasy novels are premised on it. Most action movies or fantasy novels have a small band of underdogs, very weak with little ammo power, faced with against the massive forces of evil, and somehow or the other they triumph. Right? That's basically the trope of any action movie, any fantasy novel. That's what it is. Small band of very supposedly weak people against a massive force, and they in the end triumph. However, this comes, as we will see, from a misunderstanding of what this passage is about, from a careless reading of it that ignores the ground realities required by its context. In fact, our interpretation of this passage has for the most part been flights of fancy and a desire for seeing miracles in the Bible where, sometimes there are not. And hopefully we will set something straight today. The common understanding is that we have this weak, disadvantaged David facing the strong and favored Goliath, and somehow this weak underdog manages to turn the tables on this giant, resulting in an unexpected victory. But as we shall see, this is actually not the case. So let us have a nice whirlwind exploration of our passage. It is extremely long and we can't deal with every element of it. But we will begin with the armies of the Philistines and Israelites facing off against each other with the valley of Elah between them. Both the armies had the high ground on hills, and it would have been suicidal for them, either of them, to start beginning an attack, because that would mean they would have to come down into the valley, and that would make them vulnerable. So, we have a stalemate. And in order to break this stalemate, enter Goliath. Now, there are a few things that we need to clarify about Goliath because there are a lot of fanciful ideas floating around about him. First, he is never said to be a giant. He's never said to be a giant. I don't know. What is a giant anyway? Is that like a different species of being? Or is it like just very tall people that we say are giants, meaning they're just very tall or whatever? I don't know. But he is never said to be a giant. Goliath is actually called the champion of the Philistines. So the Philistine champion has come out. Given the challenge that he issues to the Israelites, the nature of the challenge, it is very likely that he was the Philistine equivalent of a wrestling champion. He was probably not even a soldier. He was just a wrestling champion, big, well-built, and all that sort of thing. But there is a confusion about his height. The Masoretic text from the 10th century AD, which is what is used normally as a basis for most of our translations, say that his height is 6 cubits and a span, and this translates to about 9 feet and 9 inches. However, scrolls found at the Dead Sea and the 2nd century BC Greek Septuagint, all of which predate the Masoretic text by many, many centuries, have his height as 4 cubits and a span, and that translates to 6 feet 9 inches. And that is most likely the figure that we need to look at. Now, it may not seem very gigantic to us today. Yeah? A lot of people are 6 feet 9, maybe we are not, but a lot of people are. I think some people in our church may be reaching there. But 6 foot 9 inches, if he was 6 foot 9 inches, that is big because the average height of the Israelites in those days was about 5 feet 4 inches. So we are talking about a foot and a half. Goliath towered a foot and a half above most of the Israelites if he is 6 foot 9 inches. So we don't have to think, he was 9 feet 9 inches. Yeah, I mean, that's just. Now, if he was a wrestling champion, the word is a champion, not giant. If he was a wrestling champion, this is about as tall as he can be without his height actually becoming a liability in a wrestling match. A 9 foot 9 person is just set to fall. He's too tall. Yeah? Any taller, if he's much taller than that, he would have to bend down to his opponent, meaning he's already off balance. That is not how you win matches. A person taller than that could not have been a wrestling champion. So he's probably 6 feet 9 inches, not 9 feet 9 inches. Now, if Goliath was a wrestling champion, then he's a wrestling champion, meaning his reputation preceded him. So as he walked out, everyone recognized, oh, Goliath's here. Yeah? He was perhaps the undefeated champion in the Philistine wrestling circles, undefeated perhaps for many years. And he would have had to be undefeated because wrestling matches in those days almost always ended with the death of one of the competitors. They did not have our nice Olympic-style wrestling where you give points for doing this and points for doing that. They didn't do that. Yeah? The last one standing was the winner, the other one having breathed his last. That was how the competitions were. So, he was undefeated, a wrestling champion who was, because he was alive, undefeated. That's basically it. The very appearance of Goliath on the scene would have caused tremors in the hearts of the Israelites, and that is what the Bible tells us. The passage indicates that that's what happens. The Israelites were very afraid. Third, Goliath does not carry his own shield. This is extremely important, and Gladwell misses this point. Goliath doesn't carry his own shield. Now, if Goliath was a warrior, that would be the most strange thing to do. Any warrior who needs to defend himself against enemies who are going to attack him must be wielding his own defensive instruments. Would you trust someone else to parry off a blow from an enemy's sword? No, you need to do it because you know where it's striking, right? I mean, just because you moved away doesn't mean the shield bearer is going to do this. I mean, just think about it. That would be really strange way of battling. So in other words, that is not what's happening. Now, you can protect yourself properly only if you're holding the defensive equipment, not if someone else is doing it. And this indicates clearly that Goliath was not coming into the valley to do conventional battle. If he was doing that, he would have carried his own shield. He was coming down to wrestle this Israelite champion, but in order to just make sure that he was not vulnerable to the Israelite arrows, they had arrows in those days, he comes down with full armor. And he comes with offensive weapons as well, sword, spear, javelin, just in case the Israelite champion also happens to do the same. In case it turns out into a sword fight or whatever it is, he's equipped then. But the fact that he's not carrying his shield means he's not coming down there to actually fight with a sword. He's coming down there to wrestle. Fourth, Goliath's armor and weaponry are impressive, but also very heavy. Yeah? The tip of the spear itself weighed close to 7 kilograms. It's quite likely that he is wearing about 40 kilograms of armor, carrying weapons that weighed about another 20 kilograms. That's 60 kilograms he's carrying with himself, not counting the shield. And I wouldn't last a minute carrying something like that. I'd probably just, be a David and not do all of that. But think about it. I mean, I can barely carry myself around. Anyway, 60 more kilograms, that's not happening. So it's no wonder that Goliath needed assistance coming down the valley. It's a steep valley. He needs assistance of this shield bearer to come down. So, if he slips, that's the end of him, because with 60 extra kgs on him, he's not surviving any fall, no matter what protection he has. So he has this thing, and he reacts very slowly also to when David comes to the scene, because he's got 60 extra kgs on him. His height, combined with the load that he was carrying, would have made balancing a tricky thing, and so he needs this help of his armor bearer when he comes down. Goliath's armor covered pretty much every part of his body. The armor on his torso had scales to reduce the effect of sharp projectiles like arrows. The scales themselves would have deflected the arrows, that sort of thing. If you want to know about the physics behind it, we can talk about it later. His helmet, those days the helmet covered everything, including the nose, leaving only 2 small holes for the eyes. That was the kind of helmet they used those days. This is another reason he needed someone to guide him down into the valley. The small eye holes provided protection. I mean, his helmet provided massive protection, but it reduced his field of vision. Because, think about it, you have just small eye holes there, So it made it difficult for him coming down the valley slope, hence he needs assistance. The helmet was made of bronze and would have been impossible to penetrate with any conventional projectile. But the Bible says that the stone sank into Goliath's forehead. What do we make of this? Hold on to that question, Hold on to that question. Let us turn our attention now to David. David was the youngest of Jesse's sons. Being the youngest, to him fell the task of caring for his father's sheep. While tending to the sheep, he had confronted lions and bears who came to eat the juicy mutton. Anyway, predators, these lions and bears are predators that are much larger than he was. Predators that are significantly more powerful than he was. Predators whose muscles, if you look at the muscles of these animals, they contract so much more, and hence every single animal that's a predator is more agile than any human. Humans just cannot compete with another animal on the grounds of agility. Yet he had done to them what he was going to do to Goliath. And he had no doubt in his mind that he would be able to defeat Goliath. And so while Goliath has 60 kilograms of equipment on him, David equips himself only with some smooth stones and a sling. Smooth stones and a sling. The smooth stones are actually quite easy to decipher, and we should not allow any flights of fancy color or interpretation of it. In fact, there is actually nothing to interpret. They are simply 5 smooth stones chosen because they were smooth. The smoothness made them aerodynamically suitable as a projectile. Less wind air resistance because they were smooth. They fly faster. Simple thing. Gladwell also suggests that these stones are twice as dense as normal rocks. So let's hold that also. Lots of things to hold on, The number of stones is just a factual matter. Some have suggested that David took 5 stones because Goliath had 4 brothers. And why that is relevant in this context, I have no idea. David was facing Goliath, not all of his siblings. Right? Just Goliath is there. He was just preparing himself. Even the best sniper does not engage the enemy with exactly the same number of bullets as the targets he has. He's not saying, I got to kill 3 people. No, let me count 3 bullets and go. No, that would be really stupid of the person. Because so many things can happen. David was just being prepared. In case he missed, he gets 4 other shots. That's it. Nothing fancy about it. Now the sling that David had, Gladwell makes a good point. This is not a child's toy. It's not the sling, the catapult thing that you have, where you can barely launch it 10 feet away. That's not what we're talking about. These are 2 straps of leather And between them is a small pouch in which you put the projectile, the stone or whatever it is. And the slinger would place the stone, whirl the straps around about 6, 7, 8 times a second. And when he was ready to sling the stone off, he would release one of the straps and the projectile would fly off towards the target. This is not a toy, it's a very simple but sophisticated weapon. A practiced slinger could hit moving targets at distances of 200 meters also. And in our story, David is closer to Goliath than 200 meters. And Goliath is not as fast as a lion or a bear. He is burdened with 60 extra kgs and unable to move very quickly. Now, a simple calculation, I did this, so if you want to see the calculations, you can come to me later. Simple calculation for a sling of length 1 meter at 7 revolutions per second would mean that the projectile is coming at about 35 meters per second. That's 125 kilometers per hour. Okay, that's reasonably fast. Now, a modern bullet these days from a simple handgun would have a speed of about 15 times this. But if you consider that a small stone that is twice as dense as regular rock, it would have weighed probably around 10 times a bullet, a regular bullet. And this would make being hit by the stone almost as dangerous as being hit by a bullet. Almost. It's not quite as dangerous because of the much larger speed of the bullet, and also because the bullet is smaller and therefore has a greater penetrating power. So, what do we have here? We have a stone slightly less forceful than a bullet against a bronze helmet that covered Goliath's head almost completely except for 2 eye holes. A modern bullet would have ricocheted off this bronze helmet. It's not going to penetrate it. And so would the stone, because it has less penetrating power than a bullet. So the stone slung towards Goliath would have also bounced off the helmet. There is no way that that stone would have penetrated that helmet, let alone sink into Goliath's skull after that. So what do we make of this? Hey, that's the same question I asked you to hold on to earlier when we were talking about Goliath. So both the characters lead on to, what do we make of this? So, what gives? So remember that quote from Sherlock Holmes? When we have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And we need to bring that into use right now. We have an enormous drive, we Christians have an enormous drive to see miracles all over the place, miracles in the Bible, so strong that drive is, that we resolutely refuse to interpret passages such as this one in a simple logical manner. So let's lay things out and see what we have, the evidence, yeah? This is the evidence to help us sort through all of this mess that we've landed ourselves in. Or I've landed you in, whichever. Yeah. We have on the one hand a wrestling champion, 6 feet 9 inches in height. He is covered from head to foot in armor. The equipment he carries weighs about 60 kilograms. He does not carry his shield, delegating an attendant to do that, indicating that he is in the valley of Elah to wrestle his opponent, not fight with a sword or spear. He is wearing a helmet that covers his entire head except for 2 eye holes. He is facing a young shepherd boy who carries some aerodynamically appropriate stones, a sling capable of slinging the stones at about 125 kilometers per hour. Very dangerous, but not as dangerous as a modern bullet, meaning that the stones would not be able to penetrate Goliath's helmet, they would just bounce off. He just does not have enough firepower. Now we have a number of ways that we can proceed from here. First is the predominant approach that we Christians have. We ignore the physics of the situation and simply say, miracle! Yes, normal physics cannot penetrate the thing, but hey, God made it vanish instantaneously, it penetrated, who knows what, all sorts of things like that. Miracle, miracle, miracle. God somehow enabled this to happen. I do not like such special pleading for miracles. It is precisely because of such a credulous approach towards miracles and the willingness to see them everywhere that has rendered our faith untenable for many thinking people. Think about that. A lot of thinking people refuse to accept Christianity because we Christians claim that every darn thing is a miracle without looking at any possible explanations. Second approach, we could simply discount the biblical narrative as some fanciful, fantastical writing that, this story was the fruit of some overactive imagination. And if you look at the larger picture of the Bible stories, however, you will see that This one sticks out like a sore thumb. Compared to other stories, this one is full of details. Lot of details. If you look at other stories in the Bible, hardly have any details. Very rarely does the Bible speak about the height or the attire of a person. Very rarely. It hardly ever describes the equipment someone has, unless that is key to the story itself. Yet for Goliath, we have details about every bit of equipment, the material it was made of, how much it weighed, which means that must be important. Yet the story, keeping in line with the rest of the Bible, does not even describe what Goliath looks like. That's how the Bible is. You don't know what he looks like. We don't know what Jesus looks like. We don't know what Paul looks like. No, we don't know what anyone looks like. Except David, he was kind of ruddy, I think. Anyway, whatever that means. Unlike a fantastical story, the biblical story only tells us details that are actually crucial to interpreting the passage. And if the interpretation does not take that into account, there is a problem. Because otherwise the Bible doesn't give us details. Also, just dismissing the story as fictional is not really an honest way of dealing with it. If you're just going to discount what you read and say, oh, this is fictional, that's fictional, go and read a book of fiction. Don't bother. That's what I say to people who just, say, this is all just fiction. I say, go and read something that's marketed as fiction. Because then you don't have to worry. Everyone knows it's fiction. Third, we can proceed logically and see where this leads us, not shying away from any difficulties that arise along the way, facing them head on. So, we have the physical impossibility of a stone penetrating the helmet. But is this what the text says? And this is why it's important to go to the text. The Hebrew word metzach is used twice in our text, once in verse 6 and again in verse 49. The word overwhelmingly means forehead, and that is how it is translated in verse 49. However, it is translated as greaves in verse 6. Greaves or brace or something like that. What do you have? Verse 6. On his legs. Greaves. On his legs he had what? Bronze greaves, bronze armor. Okay. And that's because it cannot refer to forehead down there, right? You know that. Yeah? You know that it can't refer to forehead down there. Because on his legs he wore a bronze forehead. Makes no sense. You know that, right? Yes, we know that. And so, since it's talking about something Goliath wore on his legs, it must be, and since it's bronze, it must be an armor, a greave. Yeah? The narrator of the text goes into great detail describing Goliath's equipment, and using the word metzach with a less common meaning in verse 6, in an unambiguous way though, because we know he can't be forehead down there, in order to tell us how he is using that word. He is using a word to describe something which cannot mean anything other than the armor on the legs, so that you know how to interpret that later when it shows up. And you don't forget just because there were 43 verses between them. He didn't have to mention Goliath's greaves unless there was a purpose to it. And the purpose is to tell us how to interpret it in verse 49, because it's going to go against the grain of its normal interpretation. Metzach normally, overwhelmingly refers to forehead. But we know in verse 6 it cannot. However, our translations do not take cues from the text. They allow the primary meaning of Metzach to decide how they understand verse 49, despite the great efforts of the narrator. The narrator has told us about Goliath's helmet. It would have protected him as described earlier. And he used Metzach unambiguously in verse 6 to show us how to interpret the same word in verse 49. So, as Holmes would insist, since it was impossible for the stone to have penetrated the helmet, and since the narrator tells us that Metzach refers to Goliath's greaves in verse 6, we should conclude that this is where David struck Goliath. What do I mean? Here is a knee brace. This is a new one because I forgot the one I had at home. But anyway, this is a knee brace. I've used one on and off since 1989, and I have mentioned my knee problems before many times, I think, and you're bored of it. Do you notice anything interesting about it? How it's constructed and why, perhaps? I had an ankle brace also, but then, I didn't bring it along. I forgot everything, all my props. Anyway, I don't use the ankle brace as often, but there are similarities in construction. Both of them have this strange little hole in the protrusion where the joint is. Yeah, where the joint protrudes, your kneecap or the ankle, the heel. Yeah, that's where the hole is. And without it, actually, moving is quite difficult. If you have it completely covered, some of those braces here are completely covered. Don't buy them. It is totally pointless because it restricts your movement so much. That's not the way the joint's supposed to work. It's supposed to work with this freedom of the joint to actually move. Without this hole, moving is extremely difficult. The greaves used in the 10th and 11th century BCs were like that, yeah? When this face-off between David and Goliath happened, they were similar construction, meaning not neoprene. Come on, give me a break. There were two pieces of metal padded on the inside to protect the shin and the tissue, linked by hinges that left a gap where the joint was. In this case, the kneecap. So you would have had one piece above here, one piece down there. They were linked by hinges, and there would have been a gap there so that he can actually move. David aimed his stone at Goliath's weak spot, his proverbial Achilles heel, the kneecap, where it shattered his patella and entered the gap of the joint. Can you imagine the excruciating pain that Goliath experienced? I've had my patella kicked, and I know that's massive pain. Yeah, the patella has shattered, and now not just that, he has a foreign body inside his joint. The patella is extremely thin. Something that's flying, a stone flying at 125 kilometers per hour, will shatter it, and it will go inside the joint. There is no way that he could stand now with that joint compromised like that. He would have immediately bent forward to clasp his knees, as everyone does when they are hurt. You try to clasp the place where you have been hurt. Normal human reaction. He would have bent down to clasp it and automatically started falling because his knee now actually can't bend and support him that way. But as he's doing that, he has to bend also, therefore increasing the pain as he's falling. Remember, he has a foreign body inside his knee. Do not try this at home or anything like that. Moving the joint would have increased the pain in an unbelievable manner. And now he's in the middle of a fall, wearing 60 kilograms, falling forward because he's bent to clasp his knee, so he's already bending forward. He's carrying 60 kilograms of equipment, having this long spear on his back, the tip of which itself weighs 7 kilograms. The moment created, the torque created, is something that he cannot withstand anymore because he is now supported only by one good joint, experiencing pains the like of which none of us can imagine and which he has never faced before. There is no way he could do anything but fall face down. This is not a sign of worship or humility on his part, as some have suggested. This is simply a result of biology and physics. Nothing else is needed to explain that. And if we are rejecting that, I don't know why. There is nothing miraculous about this incident. It is simple, cool-headed strategy of a boy who had used similar strategies against lions and bears. He knew how to look for vulnerabilities in his opponent. That's what he looked. The lion and bear much more stronger than him, much more agile than he is. And he learned to look for vulnerabilities in his opponent. And he knew how to exploit those vulnerabilities and use them to his advantage. So, what do we learn from this incident? One of the very few incidences that the Bible describes at great length. I believe there are 4 lessons that we can draw from it. First, prayer. I put this first because this needs to be said first. Not that this is the first that we encounter. This needs to be said first. Prayer and action are not mutually exclusive. There is a strange, poisonous idea that the Christian faith does not require action. We are told that we should pray and then let God act. I have no idea where that came from. That would be true if one finds oneself in a position where one actually cannot act. However, we don't find David, after seeing Goliath and hearing his challenge, go out into some remote field and compose a psalm asking God for deliverance. He asks that many other places, many other psalms, yes. But what we don't see him do here is say, Saul, could you wait a minute? I just need to compose a psalm and sing to God for deliverance, and I'll be back. No. We don't see him even kneeling to pray to God to send an angel to defeat Goliath or anything like that. To the contrary, he recognizes that Goliath has a weakness that he, David, was able to exploit. And he swings into action. He does not even pause to ask God if this is what God would have him do. So even the advice, pray about it, does not work in this instance. He just looks at the situation, finds that he has a solution, and springs into action. There was a need. David was able to meet that need, and he acted. Sometimes when we say pray, we are going to pray about it, it's just an excuse for not acting. Second, always play to your strengths. Goliath, the wrestling champion, issued a challenge to the army of Israel, and everyone thought that they had to go down and wrestle him. But that naturally struck fear in their hearts. Goliath was the undefeated wrestling champion. He hadn't lost a single match. And none of these much shorter Israelites could have stood a chance against him in hand-to-hand combat. But David refused to be drawn into Goliath's trap. He would certainly engage this Gittite, but do so on his own terms. His strength was to bring down his opponent with a sling, and that's what he did. By redefining the rules of engagement, David turned all of Goliath's strengths into weaknesses, and all of his own weaknesses into strengths. David was big and strong, but therefore bulky, and unable to evade the flying projectile. David might have been of small stature, but therefore agile enough to get into a perfect position to fire that projectile. This is what we see in Jesus also when he rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday as a king. I want to show you how you can apply these kind of things, yeah? Yeah, because you'll all ask me how we apply that. Because we are not going to face a Goliath or something like that. Yeah? So another example. By choosing a donkey, he redefined what kingship entailed. By choosing to die for his friends, he relativized the finality of death. Or, as Jesus sings in Jesus Christ Superstar, to conquer death, you only have to die. Third, there is a chink in every armor. Goliath wore formidable armory. It was impregnable. The Israelites saw a towering man clad with scaled breastplate to nullify the effects of any projectile. He wore a helmet that rendered his head unassailable. Even the fragile shin bones were protected by metal greaves. Every part of him was daunting, and so the Israelites thought that his armor was impregnable. It was almost impregnable. Almost. David identified one single point of vulnerability, the gap between the greaves, and he focuses his attention on that, not on how formidable the rest of Goliath's equipment was. Because if he had a weakness, that is where David was going to attack. Every armor has to be worn. You can't mold it around a person. It has to be worn. That means it is necessarily made up of pieces, and between the pieces, where the joints are found, are normally where the weaknesses lie. So, Jesus does this when he is questioned by the Herodians and the Pharisees about the census tax. The Herodians were in favor of the tax while the Pharisees opposed it. Yet they joined together to question Jesus about it. Had Jesus supported the tax explicitly, he would have landed on the wrong side of the Pharisees. Had he explicitly opposed the tax, the Herodians would have had a field day with it. His accusers seem to have presented a stone-clad challenge. But Jesus responds, alluding to the opening verses of Genesis, with a riddle that has multiple levels of meaning, such that neither side can state outright that he has gone against their teachings. The gap there between those two teachings is where he fired his counter. Fourth, assets and liabilities are defined by the game you are playing. The tallest football player is about 6 foot 10 inches. Yeah, taller than Goliath, who's at 6 feet 9. Shorty. Anyway, but even such a tall person would be inches shorter than basketball players. Basketball, the height that is an advantage in the smaller basketball court where scoring depends on a lofty hoop is actually a disadvantage on the larger football field where scoring is closer to the ground. Someone who is that tall cannot run up and down that length of the football field. It's too long. He'll develop back problems, within a year or something like that. Besides, then he has to fire things down. Even his headers, if he can reach it, is like, yeah. Goliath came out issuing a challenge based on wrestling. Come to me, he demands of the Israelites, inviting a single warrior to a hand-to-hand wrestling match with him at close quarters. His height and build are assets for such a match. His armor would ensure that no one would be able to crush him. But when David changes the game from that of a hand-to-hand combat at close quarters to that of a slinging contest at a distance, the newly required skills of agility and speed are precisely what Goliath does not have. His bulkiness and the bulkiness of his equipment, once assets, are now liabilities. The story of David and Goliath has been misunderstood, as we have seen, on a number of levels. We have given ourselves to fanciful constructions of the story that obscure what the text is trying to tell us, and in so doing we render the two-edged text blunt. It has become a children's story with little relevance to our lives, and because our reconstructions are unbelievable, we actually do not take the account seriously. Precisely because if that was a miracle, then they're totally unbelievable. And therefore we don't even apply this. But hopefully today we have seen that looking at the text in a logical manner, we can recover what the original encounter was like. We can rid ourselves of any notion that there was anything miraculous involved. We can rearm ourselves with the knowledge that God desires our skills and our ingenuity, and that He is not some sort of a spiritual sugar daddy just waiting to bail us out of our situations. Rather, He is the one who has given us the ability to develop our intellect and our skills, and the one who has called us to use these intellects and skills when faced with oppressive situations to find advantage in disadvantage. Amen.